They laughed at her $2 dirt house until the storm erased everything else. The first frost came early that year, thin at first, just a silver skin across the prairie grass, the kind that disappears by noon, the kind people ignore. But she didn't ignore it, because frost is not the cold, it's the warning. From that morning on, everything became a count, not days on a calendar, but distance between now and failure. How long the ground would hold, how long the woodpile would last, how long a mistake could survive before it became permanent. The town had already made their decision about her. Not loudly, not cruelly, just completely. The meeting happened in the back of the supply store, where things were decided without needing to be written down. Men leaning against counters, hands rough from work, voices steady with certainty. You don't have enough lumber. You started too late. And whatever you're building out there, it won't hold through winter. No one raised their voice, because they didn't need to. This wasn't an argument. It was a conclusion. She stood in the doorway while they spoke, not interrupting, not defending, just listening. The way you listen when you already understand what people are really saying. Not about the house, about you. You can stay if you want, one of them added, almost as an afterthought. But don't expect anyone to come digging you out when it collapses. A few of them smiled at that, not out of cruelty, out of certainty. Winter doesn't forgive experiments. That was the last thing said before the conversation ended, not loudly, but with weight, like a door closing. She nodded once, then she left. No protest, no explanation, just movement. No one followed her out, because in their minds, the outcome was already decided. And people don't follow what they believe is already finished. From the ridge above the settlement, her place stood apart. Not far, just enough to be separate, enough to be seen and judged. It didn't look like a house, not the way theirs did. No straight timber walls, no raised structure catching the light, no sharp lines, no height. It sat low, pressed into the land, as if it had been pushed down instead of built up. Earth, layered, thick, uneven. Dark strips of sod stacked one over another, roots still woven through them, holding the soil together. Not shaped by tools, shaped by weight. A structure that didn't stand against the land. It became part of it. To them, it looked like poverty, like fear, like someone who didn't know what they were doing. House built by someone preparing to fail. They called it what they understood, a mistake. But they weren't watching the right thing. None of them were. Because every day something moved across that land. Not loud, not visible at first, but constant. Wind. Not the kind that comes and goes, the kind that stays. It moved over the ridge, across open ground, picking up speed, picking up force. And the longer it traveled, the stronger it became. She had seen it clearly a few days before the frost, not in the wind, in the rain. A light rain at first, barely enough to matter, until it began to move. Thin lines forming across the dirt, joining, accelerating, cutting deeper with every inch. By the time it reached the bottom of the slope, the soil was gone. Not all at once, not violently, but completely. Grain by grain, taken, because nothing had slowed it. The wind did the same thing, just colder, just slower, just harder to see, until it was too late. And every house in that settlement was built to face it. Flat walls, open exposure, straight lines, nothing to slow it, nothing to break it, nothing to shorten it. They thought they were building shelter. She saw something else. They were building paths, straight lines, for the cold to run through. She didn't start building right away. Not after the meeting. Not after the frost. Because the problem wasn't clear yet, and building without understanding is just another way to fail. So she watched, not the houses, not the people, the ground, where the wind touched first, where it sped up, where it slowed, where it left nothing behind. Morning after morning, she stood on that same slope, not moving much, just observing. Because movement hides patterns, stillness reveals them. At first, it looked random. Snow drifting one way, then another. Dust lifting, then settling. But over time, the same lines appeared, the same paths, the same directions, the same losses. The wind wasn't chaotic. It was consistent. It followed the land, the shape, the slope, the open distance. And every time it crossed that ridge, it gained strength. Not because it changed, because nothing stopped it. She tested it, not with tools, with small things. Loose soil in her hand, letting it fall, watching how far it traveled, where it landed, how fast it disappeared. A strip of cloth tied to a stake, left overnight. By morning, it pointed the same direction every time. Not violently, just enough. Enough to matter. She walked between the houses one afternoon, past straight walls, raised floors, clean corners. The kind of structures that looked finished, that looked right. And she felt it. The cold didn't sit still inside them. It moved. Through gaps, along walls, across floors. always moving. That was the part no one measured. Not temperature, movement. Because temperature can be fought. You can burn more wood, build bigger fires, but movement carries everything away. Heat is not lost all at once. It's taken, the same way the soil was taken. Grain by grain, layer by layer, until there's nothing left to hold. That was the mistake. Not the cold, the distance. How far it was allowed to run before anything slowed it. She went back to her slope before sunset, stood where the ground began to drop, where the wind picked up speed, and she looked at the space between. Open, unbroken, uninterrupted. That was where the damage happened. Not at the house, not at the wall, before it ever got there. If it reached the wall with speed, the wall didn't matter. It would take the heat the same way the rain had taken the soil. So she stopped thinking about walls. Walls resist. But resistance is not the same as control. She thought about the ground instead. How the rain could be slowed, not stopped, broken into smaller movements, shorter paths, less force. The answer wasn't strength. It was interruption. You don't stop something like that. You change how far it can go before it loses power. She looked at her half-built structure. Low, unfinished, wrong by every standard they believed in. And for the first time, it made sense. Not as a house, as a system. Not to block the winter, to shorten it. Because if the cold couldn't run, it couldn't take everything with it. And that was the only thing that mattered. Not how much heat you had, but how much you kept. She started building the next morning. Not faster, more precisely. Because now she knew what she was building against. Not the cold, movement. The first change wasn't the cabin itself. It was the ground in front of it. The path the wind had been taking. Unbroken, uninterrupted. She cut into it. Not deep, not wide, just enough. A shallow ridge running across the slope. Then another behind it. Then another. Each one small, but placed with intention. Not walls, interruptions. The first time the wind crossed them, nothing obvious happened. No dramatic change, no sudden stillness. But the snow told the truth. It no longer moved in a straight line. It broke, split, settled sooner. That was enough. She turned back to the cabin. The sod walls were already there, low and heavy. But now, she changed how they met the ground. No sharp edges, no flat faces. Everything angled, everything sloped, everything forcing the air to move around instead of through. She thickened the north side first, layer after layer of sod, roots interlocked, soil packed tight. Not stacked for height, stacked for mass. Because mass doesn't react quickly. And anything that doesn't react quickly doesn't lose quickly. She pressed the wall outward, wider at the base, narrower at the top, a shape that didn't resist the wind. It absorbed it. Then she connected it to the ground itself. No gap, no clean separation. The wall didn't sit on the land. It grew from it. Inside, she kept the space small, smaller than it should have been, lower than anyone would accept. Because empty space is just more air to lose. The roof came next, not high, not steep. A low cover, reinforced with sod, weight holding it down, sealing it tighter with every layer. When the first wind pushed against it, it didn't whistle, it didn't rattle. It pressed and stopped. Not completely, but enough. She worked through the days without rushing, because rushing creates gaps, and gaps are where loss begins. Every seam packed, every edge softened, every line broken. Nothing left straight, nothing left exposed. From the ridge, it looked worse than before. Lower, darker, almost buried. A structure disappearing instead of standing. They passed by sometimes, slowing just enough to look, then moving on. No one stopped, because there was nothing to recognize. It didn't look stronger. It didn't look finished. It didn't look like anything they understood. But the ground around it had changed. The wind no longer crossed cleanly. The snow no longer traveled far. The movement was shorter. And inside, the air began to behave differently. It didn't rush. It didn't pull heat from one side to the other. It held. Not warm, not yet, but stable. That was the first real sign. Because warmth can be created later, but stability has to be built first. By the time the second frost came, she stopped measuring the outside, because the outside no longer mattered the same way. What mattered was how little changed inside. And for the first time, it didn't follow the cold. It lagged, held, stayed. And that meant, when the real winter arrived, it wouldn't start from zero. it would start from something already held. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It tightened, day by day, taking something each time. First the edges, then the space between, then anything left exposed. The wind came with it, not in bursts, in pressure, constant, steady, unrelenting. The kind that doesn't pass through, it stays. That was when the difference began to show. At first, it looked like effort, more wood being carried, more fires being fed, more movement just to keep the same warmth. Then came the second sign. Loss. Wood piles shrinking faster than expected. Trips outside shorter. Risk heavier. Because every step into that wind took something with it. Then the third. Failure. Not all at once. Never all at once. One house at a time. A fire that couldn't hold through the night. A wall that iced from the inside. A door that wouldn't seal again once opened. Because once the cold finds a path, it doesn't need much. Just enough. Her cabin didn't escape it, but it didn't collapse either. The temperature dropped, slowly, but it didn't fall through. The fire burned low, sometimes nearly gone, and still, the air inside didn't match the air outside. Not warm, not comfortable. Controlled. That was the difference. Because outside, everything was reacting. Inside, nothing was rushing. The wind hit the slope, but it didn't carry through. It broke, slowed, lost distance before it ever reached the wall. And what reached the wall had less to take. Inside, the air didn't move the same way. No pulling across the floor. No cold, dragging heat from corner to corner. It settled, held longer, left slower. That was enough. By the fifth day, the settlement began to change. Not in sound, in silence. Less movement outside, less smoke rising, fewer doors opening. Because people were no longer working against the cold, they were losing to it. One man tried to cross between buildings, didn't make it halfway. Another burned through his wood by morning, then started on the furniture. Intensity increased, but it didn't matter, because intensity doesn't stop loss. It only delays it. On the seventh day, someone came up the ridge. Slow, unsteady, walking without direction. He reached the edge of her place, stopped, looked at the ground, then at the structure. Nothing made sense. There was no height, no visible strength. He stepped closer and felt it. Not heat, not directly, but the absence of loss. The wind wasn't taking everything here. That was enough. He knocked once, then again. She opened the door. He didn't ask. He just stepped inside and stopped. Because the air didn't behave the way it should. It didn't rush to replace what was lost, because nothing was being taken that fast. He stayed near the wall, hand resting against the packed earth, feeling what he couldn't explain. Not warmth, stability. More came the next day, then another, then a few more. Not because they understood it, because they saw what hadn't failed. And in a winter like that, what holds is all that matters. When the storm finally loosened, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something had been measured, not by time, not by temperature, by what remained. The wind didn't stop all at once. It withdrew, slowly, leaving everything exposed behind it. The ridge was still there. The ground still held its shape. But the settlement below had changed. Not in noise, in absence. Fewer fires, fewer voices, fewer places that still worked. She stepped outside for the first time in days. The snow had settled into the land, filling the gaps, softening the edges, hiding what had failed underneath it. The path down toward the settlement was still there, but it didn't feel the same, because the difference wasn't in what you could see. It was in what had lasted. The ones who had come to her cabin didn't leave right away, not because they couldn't, because they understood something had changed. They stood outside, looking at it now, not judging it, not measuring it by shape or size, but by what it had done. One of them ran his hand along the slope, pressed the packed earth, looked at the ground in front of it, then back toward the open ridge where the wind had traveled. It didn't reach the same way, he said quietly. She didn't answer immediately, because explanation wasn't what they needed anymore. They had seen it. Another man stood where the wind had once crossed cleanly, now broken by ridges, slowed, shortened. He didn't speak, just nodded once. Understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It forms after something fails. They went back down the ridge in small groups, not talking much, because there was nothing left to argue. only something to change. That spring, the settlement didn't rebuild the same way. Not completely different, not all at once, but enough. The next cabins sat lower, the north walls thicker, the ground shaped before the structure, not after. They stopped building against the wind and started building against its path. They didn't call it anything. No one named it. No one claimed it. Because it didn't feel like an invention. It felt like something that had always been there, just unnoticed. Someone eventually asked her, months later, when the ground had softened again, "How did you know it would hold?" She looked out across the slope, where the ridges still broke the land. "I didn't," she said. "I just saw what was being taken and made it travel less." That was all it ever was. Not more strength, not more heat, just less loss. The place they had laughed at stayed, low, quiet, unchanged. Not because it was stronger, because it gave the winter less to take.